In 3rd century Rome, emperors met bloody ends, and the legions immediately crowned the next ruthless warlord in line. But when the victorious Emperor Aurelian was assassinated by a treacherous secretary, that brutal cycle suddenly stopped. His death created an absolute power vacuum. Instead of anointing a new general, the grieving legions did something bizarre. They sent a dutiful letter to the politicians, asking the Senate to pick a successor. The politicians were terrified of an armed mob changing its mind and refused the offer. The army, feeling genuinely repentant over Aurelian's murder, refused to take charge. The result was a bizarre institutional paralysis. This standoff stretched on for 8 amazing months. The world's most aggressive military empire functioned peacefully without a sovereign, without a usurper, and without a civil war. Daily life went on. The generals and local magistrates appointed by Aurelian simply kept executing their ordinary functions, maintaining order without top-down leadership. Eventually, intelligence arrived that shattered the quiet. German tribes had crossed the Rhine and were occupying major cities in Gaul. The peaceful interregnum was an unsustainable fluke. When foreign armies are marching on your territory, you urgently need a definitive military leader to fight them. The external pressure forced the Senate to finally act. They chose Tacitus, a 75-year-old billionaire scholar. He had been quietly reading in his luxurious seaside villas, far from the battlefields. The Senate enthusiastically named him emperor. They explicitly prioritized his innocent life and civilian wisdom, deciding the empire needed a mind rather than a body, a sovereign rather than a soldier. With their man on the throne, the politicians immediately reclaimed their legal rights. This chart shows them back at the top, taking control over consuls and diverting military revenue to public service. They fired off circular letters to major cities, boasting they had recovered their legal authority and restored the true republic. They mistook the military's temporary grief for a permanent surrender. They believed passing laws and writing letters meant they were actually in charge. But legal paperwork means nothing to an invading horde. Almost immediately, Tacitus was pulled from his warm retirement and forced to travel to the freezing Caucasus Mountains to fight off the Alani tribe. Seconded by brave, experienced veterans, the elderly emperor's legions violently clashed with the Scythian invaders, slaughtering them completely. Despite the tactical victory, the grueling reality of winter camp life took its toll. The unaccustomed physical hardships utterly broke the 75-year-old emperor's body. Soon, the soldiers' brief enthusiasm for civic virtue evaporated. Factions raged within the camp. Their demands grew impossible to satisfy, and they began openly mutinying against their mild, civilian leader. Tacitus died of anguish and exhaustion after a reign of just 6 months. A brilliant intellect and perfect constitutional legitimacy are entirely useless when you are trapped in a freezing tent with an angry, heavily armed mob. Tacitus's eyes were barely closed before his brother, Florianus, hastily usurped the throne. He bypassed the Senate entirely, treating the empire like a private family inheritance. The Eastern armies immediately issued a countermove. They elevated their own commander, a battle-hardened veteran named Probus. Probus was vastly outnumbered, but he had strategic patience. He held the mountain passes and let the sultry summer heat of Cilicia sicken Florianus's unacclimated European troops. The weakened soldiers soon murdered Florianus themselves, handing Probus an easy victory. The rapid collapse of Florianus proved that political power in Rome was no longer something you could safely inherit. It was something you had to physically conquer. Now, holding complete military dominance, Probus wrote a masterfully deferential letter to the politicians back home. He humbly submitted his merits to their clemency and asked for their legal ratification. The Senate eagerly read the letter and celebrated. They passed decrees conferring every imperial title upon him, blind to the reality that they were simply being placated. The ultimate reality was purely mathematical. This visualization scales the few hundred civilian politicians in Rome against the overwhelming weight of Probus's 400,000 armed mercenaries. He allowed the Senate to manage civil administration solely because he held absolute physical leverage over them. As the historian Gibbon observed, those who refuse the sword must renounce the scepter. True political authority cannot exist as a theatrical performance on paper. It requires the physical power to enforce it. The late 3rd century pushed the Roman Empire to the breaking point. Surrounded by enemies and exhausted by decades of relentless border conflicts, the frontiers were buckling under the pressure of constant invasions. Into this vacuum stepped Emperor Probus. He approached the collapsing frontiers with the precision of a military engineer, applying absolute discipline to a world in chaos. In less than 6 years, he launched a hyper-aggressive campaign across Gaul. He repelled the Franks into the marshes, forced the Burgundians to abandon their plunder, and secured 70 cities that had been completely overrun. He even broke the Lygian Ari, a terrifying tribe operating on the edges of Silesia. They fought exclusively in the dead of night, using black shields and pitch-black bodies to appear as phantom warriors in the dark. Roman discipline dismantled these phantoms. Through sheer active vigor, Probus shattered the wandering power of the Germanic tribes and forced the surviving princes to fall prostrate at his camp. To ensure they never returned, Probus replaced the old wooden palisades with a continuous stone wall, stretching nearly 200 miles from the Rhine to the Danube, fortified with towers at precise intervals. The frontier was locked down. The interior provinces finally saw a return to agriculture and commerce. The relief was so profound that citizens and poets began to celebrate the return of a mythical golden age. But achieving this peace required an enormous, highly trained war machine. Maintaining an empire this massive demands constant vigilance, and an army with nothing left to fight is a danger unto itself. Part of Probus's strategy involved demographic engineering. He took 16,000 captured barbarian warriors and dispersed them in small squads across the Roman provinces, intending to use them as a hidden military buffer. The strategy backfired. A group of Franks resettled on the Black Sea coast revolted, stole a Roman fleet, and sailed straight through the Bosphorus into the open Mediterranean. These rogue warriors cruised along the coasts of Greece and Africa, raiding unsuspecting targets. They eventually landed in Sicily and sacked Syracuse, a wealthy cultural capital that hadn't seen serious violence in centuries. They massacred the inhabitants and sailed all the way back to their northern homelands. The attempt to perfectly calculate border defense had created an entirely new vulnerability, proving the empire was simply too large for a single man to manage. Probus also realized his own legions were a problem. A massive, idle, standing army is expensive, and bored soldiers are prone to rebellion. He even openly expressed a desire to eventually abolish the military force altogether. To keep them busy, he ordered his veteran troops to perform exhausting civil engineering tasks, like planting vineyards and draining the pestilential, mosquito-filled marshes of Syrium. In the brutal heat of summer, the exhausted legionaries snapped. They threw down their shovels, grabbed their swords, and brutally assassinated Probus inside an iron tower while he was supervising the drainage project. Then, ignoring the Roman Senate entirely, the troops immediately elevated their own commander, Carus, to the throne. The military was now the only true law. Carus was an austere, ruthless veteran. When Persian ambassadors arrived to negotiate peace, they found the new emperor sitting in the dirt, eating stale bacon. Taking off his cap, he told them that unless Persia submitted, he would leave their lands as totally barren as his own bald head. The murder of Probus and the rise of Carus laid the reality of the empire bare. The civil government in Rome was dead, and the era of the soldier emperor had arrived in full force. Carus made good on his threat. He marched deep into Mesopotamia, cutting through enemy forces and capturing the supposedly impregnable Persian capital of Ctesiphon. The Roman world celebrated. The public fully expected the permanent conquest of the East and the total elimination of the Persian threat. But then, during a freak thunderstorm, Carus's camp was plunged into total darkness. In the confusion, a cry rang out. The emperor's pavilion burst into flames. When the storm cleared, Carus was found dead. The official report from the chamberlain stated he was struck by a bolt of lightning. The timing was highly suspicious. Given his cruel temper, historians widely suspect the natural disaster was cover for an assassination, orchestrated by his own inner circle or commanders. With Carus dead, the eastern conquests evaporated, and back in Europe, the 200-mile stone wall built by Probus was overthrown by the Alemanni within a few years of his death. the entire facade crumbled. Probus and Carus were highly competent, decisive leaders. They secured borders, defeated rivals, and commanded the deadliest army on Earth. Their deaths reveal the ultimate cost of a militarized state. By tethering the survival of the empire to a massive war machine, Rome had created a system where the army itself was the primary threat to the throne. The powerful Emperor Carus was dead on the Persian frontier, his tent struck by lightning during a fierce storm. Ancient armies viewed lightning with intense religious terror. The Roman legions decided the gods had marked the Tigris River as an impassable boundary, and they demanded an immediate retreat. The empire suddenly fell to Carus's two sons, Carinus and Numerian. Born and educated as private citizens, they had spent their lives as commoners before their father's sudden election to emperor just 16 months earlier. Steering the empire through such a precarious transition required a rare combination of discipline and political vision. Carinus and Numerian now held ultimate power, but neither had any experience with the high-stakes machinery of Roman governance. When a throne is inherited without a clear record of military or civic success, the stability of the entire state rests on the personal character of the men in charge, a fragile foundation for an empire of 80 million people. The younger brother, Numerian, began the long march back from Persia. The harsh desert climate had given him a severe eye infection, forcing him to spend the entire journey confined to the total darkness of a sealed and closed litter. His father-in-law, Arrius Aper, seized control of the situation. For days, Aper stood outside the imperial pavilion, delivering supposed orders and mandates from a sovereign no one was allowed to see. The legions grew suspicious of the endless delays and secrecy. Breaking into the guarded tent, they found only Numerian's lifeless, decomposing body. The military responded with strict discipline. They convened a massive council at Chalcedon and formally elected the commander of the bodyguards, Diocletian, to the purple. Diocletian wasted no time securing his position. He drew his sword and executed Aper right at the foot of the tribunal, asserting his supreme authority in front of the entire army. Numerian's passive weakness and physical absence allowed his power to be completely usurped from within. An invisible ruler quickly becomes an irrelevant one. Back in the capital, the older brother Carinus took the exact opposite approach. He abandoned himself entirely to luxury, living a highly visible life centered around the colossal entertainment venues of Rome. He purged his father's experienced advisors and handed the highest civic offices to his favorite entertainers. He even appointed one of his doorkeepers as governor of the city and let a convicted forger sign all his official documents. His personal cruelty deeply alienated the Roman nobility. In a matter of months, he married and discarded 9 successive wives, leaving many of them pregnant, while actively mocking the elite families of the Senate. To maintain his grip on the populace, he staged impossibly lavish public games. This ancient floor mosaic depicts the kind of extravagant beast hunts Carinus hosted, filling the arenas with thousands of exotic animals, including hippopotamuses, rhinos, and hundreds of lions. The financial drain was immense. The physical infrastructure for these spectacles included protective nets woven entirely of gold wire and dividing walls studded with precious gemstones. The common citizens cheered the extravagant shows, but his erratic cruelty and massive spending secretly united his closest ministers and military officers against him. Carinus used blinding, expensive spectacle exactly the way Numerian used the dark tent. Both were extreme methods to hide a core incompetence that simply could not last. Diocletian, now commanding the eastern troops, marched west to depose the tyrant and claim the rest of the empire. The inevitable collision occurred near the strategic boundary of the Danube River, on the plains of Margus. Diocletian's forces were exhausted from the long Persian campaign. Against all expectations, Carinus's well-funded, rested Western legions were actually winning the battle, breaking through the eastern lines. But victory evaporated in an instant. A single Roman tribune in the Western army drew his sword and assassinated Carinus directly on the chaotic battlefield. The tribune acted on a deeply personal grievance. He sought revenge for his own honor, killing the emperor because Carinus had seduced his wife. With his rival dead, Diocletian accepted the surrender of the Western legions and immediately initiated a multi-decade era of ruthless, systemic efficiency. Carinus possessed the legal title, the massive treasury, and the winning army. Yet all those systemic advantages provided no protection from the fatal, immediate consequences of his own character flaws.